Good afternoon. We'll get started. I'm Fred Leon, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Consortium for Multicultural Psychology Research. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our 2012 Annual Distinguished Lecture in Multicultural Psychology. Time has gone by quickly. This is the fifth in our series. I also wanted to remind you that the videos of all our previous lectures are available on our CMPR website, and we're videotaping this one as well. Before I introduce our distinguished invited speaker, I'd like to take care of a couple of items first. First, I'd like to remind everyone that we'll be having a reception with some light refreshments and drinks at the end of the presentation from 5 to 6 upstairs in room 230. So everyone is invited, and I hope that many of you can stay for that reception, which is to honor our invited speaker, our special guest, and the winner of this year's Joseph L. White Student Award. Next, I'm pleased to continue our tradition of presenting the Joseph L. White Outstanding Student Multicultural Research Award at the beginning of our annual distinguished lecture. To present this year's award winner, I'd like to introduce the chair of our awards committee this year, Professor Anne-Marie Ryan.
This year's award committee consists of myself, Brent Donlin, and Rich Lucas. We had the pleasure of reading through a number of very high quality papers, really wonderful research being done in our department by our graduate students related to multicultural psychology. I'm pleased to announce the winner for this year is Stevie Yap for his paper, Mediators of the Relationship Between Racial Identity and Life Satisfaction in a Community Sample of African American Women and Men. If Stevie could come up and receive the certificate and also the check that goes with this for this award.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and congratulations again, Steve. Now, back to our main event. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor James Jackson. James is the Daniel Katz Distinguished University Professor of Psychology, Professor of Health Behavior and Health Education in the School of Public Health, and Professor of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. He is the Director and Research Professor at the Institute for Social Research, and he's the past director of the Program for Research on Black Americans and the Center for African American and African Studies. He's the past chair of the section of Social Economic Political Sciences at AAAS, and he's the former national president of the Black Student Psychological Association and ABSI, the Association of Black Psychologists, as well as SPICI, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. He served on the Council of the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Aging. He's a member of the Advisory Council to the NIH Director. He's a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America, Society of Experimental Social Psychology, the American Psychological Association, and APS, the Association of Psychological Science, as well as the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the New York Academy of Medicine, and the W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. He received the Distinguished Career Contributions to Research Award from the Society of Psychological Study of Ethnic Minority Issues from APA, the James McKean Cattell Fellow for the Distinguished Career Contribution to Applied Psychology, the APS Perlman Prize for Excellence in Research on Aging, and the University of Southern California Senior Health Policy Investigator, and so forth. He is an elected member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I could continue, but we'd like to save some time for his presentation. The title of his presentation is The Social Psychology of Population Differences in Health. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Jackson.
It's certainly my pleasure to be here, and I always love coming back to Michigan State University. I'll tell you why in just a second. But I thank you and thank the Fred and the selection committee for this honor. The fact is that I'm an undergraduate of Michigan State University. I graduated in 1966. I know that doesn't mean much for some of you out there in terms of age. I started here as in electrical engineering in 1962. I was going to be an engineer and do wonderful things in that area, but wound up getting my degree in psychology instead. And in fact, I almost went to Olds Hall this afternoon on my way up here, because that's what I remember where the psychology department was. I received excellent training here at Michigan State University in psychology. I worked with people like Keach, Ratner, and other people who were here. That's a blast for the past, but it certainly served me well over the course of my career. Now, I do get here in the fall, particularly, just about every other weekend or so. I make 6 or 7 trips up here. I'm a big Spartan football fan. I hate to admit that. I also go to bowl games, and I went to the championship game in Indianapolis, and so on. And I even give them money every once in a while. So I am a true Spartan. Oh, this has been recorded, isn't it? I can see Mary Sue Coleman not being very happy about this talk, so we'll see. So without further ado, though, let me launch into what I consider to be a relatively big talk. Some of it is controversial, I think. It'll be fair to say. But I'll tell you when the controversial stuff is coming up, and then we can kind of talk about that. I've been very much interested in the issue with regard to how we understand population differences. And fact is, in some ways, this talk is a prelude to the talk that I'm going to give for APS. I'm giving an opening address at APS in May, and actually that talk is going to build on the talk today. So the genesis of this work that I've been involved with for a very long time actually derives from 3 different considerations. And the first is the issue of race differences in psychiatric statuses. And I'm going to talk a lot about psychiatric statuses today because it's very important. Historically, and this just shows you how smart I am. I go back and read things from 1840 and other kinds of stuff. There's probably a lack of truth to that, but indeed, these are all some of the studies that focused on the issues of psychiatric differences in population groups, particularly by race and ethnicity. And they focused on difference with regard to admission rates. So back in the day, it was considered that admission rates was just as good a way to get an assessment of the degree of psychopathology within a given population group as any other way. And if we looked at the data, it all looked something like this, which said that for the most part, African Americans, let me focus on that group today, had higher rates of psychiatric disorders than did non-Hispanic whites, just to make that particular comparison. And in some ways, all was right with the world, because it made sense in a world that said that a group is particularly disadvantaged, that indeed it should have higher rates of psychiatric disorders. So this way of understanding it was really consistent with that particular view. However, when we started measuring rates of psychiatric disorders by going to community surveys, and the first was the ECA, Epidemiological Catchment Area Survey, what we found was a very different story. What we found is that non-Hispanic whites actually had higher prevalence of all the major disorders than African Americans. And as I'll show you later on, there's been no study since this 1981 study that has ever found anything else but that. And it is a significant difference, and indeed, non-Hispanic whites have higher rates. All is not right with the world. All is not right with the world. Why in the world could that possibly be that a more disadvantaged group indeed has lower rates of the major disorders than a group that's more advantaged? And no one's ever been actually able to explain this. So this is another issue, and this has to do with regard to rates of lifetime alcohol disorders. And this finding is really kind of straightforward. What we find is that if we look at age differences and age cohort differences, that for African Americans, they actually have very high rates of alcohol disorders in older ages, while whites have lower rates. Same thing you get with regard to women, but the numbers are easier here. This has been explained by the fact that this is a cohort effect. That indeed this group that's older here in 1981 when this was taken was a group that always had high rates, even when they were younger. But I can tell you that's not true. It is something about the life course that leads to these particular higher rates of disorders, particularly for men in older ages than for non-Hispanic white men. The second issue had to do with regard to the role of motivation in physical and mental health. Motivation has been something that's not been part of the discussion very much. And in fact, particularly individual motivation in terms of how we understand physical and mental health, and particularly the epidemiology of it. So I always like to show this because mind is a terrible thing to lose. There's one person here who knows where this is going. And you can say, I'm sure either Freud said this, or Pogo, or some other kind of very famous philosopher. This was actually a statement from Vice President Dan Quayle. And Dan Quayle said this at some date when he was Vice President as a misquote of the United Negro College Fund banner, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste," which we understand that. But Dan Quayle said, "A mind is a terrible thing to lose." So part of my talk today, and by the end of it, is to vindicate Vice President Quayle. Because Vice President Quayle actually got it right. And a major part of what I'm going to talk about in this framework and the model has to do with regard to the motivational issue about being worried about losing one's mind. And being worried about losing one's mind causes people to do all kinds of things. Because what's worse than having a disorganized mind and losing one's particular identity? There's nothing worse than that. And I will argue that people will do all kinds of unbelievable things in order to avoid this kind of disorganized state. And that becomes important for understanding these population differences in health and mental health that I'm going to talk about. The third observation is just straightforward observations of popular culture. And I'm going to really bring all this back together, good folks, I promise. In this issue, I'm messing up that camera, aren't I? I'm going to try to do better. And my example just comes from Janet Ivanovich. And most people, when I give a talk in academic circles, pretend like they have no idea who this woman is. But the fact is, she writes airplane novels. Airplane novel is one, you get on a plane in Detroit and you go into New York and it's finished by the time you land. And so she writes those kind of novels. But her protagonist, Stephanie Plum, is always in all kinds of trouble. Her car is getting blown up, people are breaking to her apartment, she's just in terrible trouble. And she's always then eating comfort foods, all types of comfort foods, in order to do something about this kind of chronically stressful conditions that she lives in. And this is part of our culture. We actually understand that in advertisements and how we think about things and so on. This becomes a very important part of this story as well. People's health behaviors, for which they make choices about, are actually in some ways motivated by this issue with regard to losing one's mind. And the whole purpose of my talk today is how do we bring these facts together? One, the fact that African Americans have lower rates of psychiatric disorders, but as I'll show you in a moment, incredibly higher rates of all the physical disorders and mortality. How do we account for that? And how do we do and understand people who engage in these particular kinds of behaviors, which are not necessarily good for their physical health? So I'm going to talk about social determinants of poor health, the law of small effects and race disparities, race and race differences and opportunities which exist in the United States of America. I'm going to talk about the poor structured conditions of living by race in this particular country. I'm going to talk about constant environmental stressors and stress. This is the major culprit that I think accounts for why we observe a whole set of things I'm going to share with you. I'm going to talk about affordances, and I use this in the Gibsonian sense, and I'm talking about environmental affordances for unhealthy coping strategies that people engage in, and talk about the chronic activation of the stress response network as the biological mechanism that indeed accounts for why we observe the kinds of things we observe. I'm going to talk about poor health behaviors to cope with the stressors of life, ensuing physical health disorders, but protection from mental health disorders. And I'm going to draw this particular model as we go along. This is just very quickly to say this. All differences between population groups are not disparities. There are differences between population groups that may indeed be due to culture. They may be due to behavioral facts and other kinds of things that are not disparities. Disparities ensue from unfairness in the particular environment, from discrimination and other kinds of biases. And we need to understand that particular distinction. Just because there's a difference between a population group doesn't necessarily mean that it's a disparity. This is very important consideration as we go along, and I want to make this point that you understand that. The issue is that what we understand in terms of disparities between groups are a product of the life course. And I draw this awful drawing, I did this, which shows the life course this particular sort of way, and we have people who are in an advantaged group. Let's think about non-Hispanic whites in this particular culture, and groups and individuals who are in a disadvantaged groups. The average of these groups are what we talk about in terms of disparities when we talk about population differences. But the fact is that in the life course, these particular stressors bear down on both population groups. And by that stressors, I mean things like poor economic consequences, or living in bad neighborhoods, or the events that happen to one, loss of a spouse, or losing a child, and so on. These are all these stressors that bear down on people. If you are in this group, the advantaged group, indeed, you have greater material resources and other resources to withstand these particular kinds of stressors. If you are in this group, on the other hand, you don't have those kind of material resources, and those stressors really bear down hard on you. And people start off somewhat even, although one of the most controversial things I'm going to say is that people really don't, depending on what group they're in. But one has to remember this with regard to what happens over the life course and these stressors that are bearing down, and the fact is that they're having negative consequences for people. Chronic stress is the real culprit in all of these things, I believe. So race is important. It's very relevant. And what I mean by race is race, immigration, culture, and ethnicity. And it's very difficult to understand anything outside of this particular context within gender, age, and SES. In fact, you can't do that. Now, there are a lot of my colleagues in psychology who are empirical scientists who say that this has a kind of a la-la, kind of kumbaya kind of feel to it. The notion of intersectionality emerged out of the humanities. It did not emerge in the social and behavioral sciences. Our work at Michigan, and what we're interested in doing, is putting an empirical face on what we mean by intersectionality. To show and to demonstrate empirically, how does race impact the differences we see? How does immigration impact culture, ethnicity? And how all of this through the lens of gender, age, and SES. And I'm going to be talking about some of these things. And we think that you can empirically demonstrate what these effects are and do studies that are replicable. So social inequalities in health, just to go quickly. There's a ton of research on this. There's been 15,000 papers, 15 billion papers, on how relative position and power and so on affect certain kinds of health outcomes. So power, social participation, social environment, behavior, and early life. And a lot of the frameworks or the models for this look something like this. And it looks like over here is early life, genes, and culture for people. And they are seen through the social environment, social structure, work, health behaviors, psychological issues, pathophysiological changes, brain, neuroendocrine, and immune, all functioning to affect mortality, morbidity, and so on. There's nothing wrong with this model. It's right. It has to be right, because everything is in it. I mean, it's right. I mean, to say it's oversaturated is probably being, it's just unbelievable. But these are the kind of frameworks that are oftentimes used. But you can't do very much with that. And the framework that I'm going to try to build for you today, is intermediate theoretical framework from which you can derive predictions from. But it begins with this particular kind of notion of how we think things affect those outcomes. And if we look at the data, it's very clear. So you are much better off in terms of how long you live if you have a higher position occupation. This is Marmot's work, and I think everybody knows this by now. It's been demonstrated hundreds of times. The PSID, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, shows for people who are 45 to 64 years of age, if you make more money, you have lower levels of mortality. You live longer if you make more money. I mean, these are things that are well known. If you live in a state which is wealthy, you live longer. And really is good, if you really want to live a long time, then move to Canada. And then you can really do well. All right, and this is, of course, open to all kinds of ecological fallacies, there's no doubt about it, but it is consistent with regard to the individual data as we see it. Now, race matters. There are a lot of people who really don't believe that. They want to say, well, race really doesn't matter. It's really about issues having to do with social economic status and other kinds of issues. But race indeed does matter. And if we look at data like this, in terms of life expectancy between whites and blacks, these are consistent. Whites tend to live longer than whites than blacks from birth. That was true in '68, it was true in 2000, and it's true today. For whatever the reason, the differences are 6 to 7 to 8 years, depending upon your gender. You tend to live longer if you are white. We're going to come back to that. The infant mortality rate differences between blacks and whites has gone down, so you see a secular trend or a decrease with regard to infant mortality, but you still see these stubborn racial differences that exist between these two. This is a graph that I really like, and what it essentially shows is that pregnancy-related mortality ratio is actually higher for higher educated black women than for lower educated black women. That is, it's not simply a story about social economic status, that indeed race makes a difference and has an independent contribution to what we might observe in terms of mortality and morbidity. If you look at the probability of survival from age 15 to 65 years, what this shows is the highest rate of survival is for U.S. white males overall. But notice that poor white males, which is the second bar, have longer lifetime than U.S. blacks overall, but certainly lower than poor black males. It's not just simply a story about social economic status. But the question is, why should you observe this? Why should we observe the kinds of things that I've shown you? These consistent differences, particularly for African Americans, and inconsistent differences for Caribbeans, Latinos, and Asians, in terms of disparities among groups for things like mortality and morbidity. Especially since the most common way that we know what group you belong to is that we ask you. We say to you, what are you? And African Americans will say, I'm African American, right? Or somebody looks at you and say that you belong in those particular groups. So we need to ask the question, what in the world does a person's social identity have to do with regard to group disparities and morbidity and mortality like I've shown you? Because what it means is that if a group of people say, I'm African American, and we aggregate those people together, and a group of people say, I'm non-Hispanic whites, and we aggregate those people together, if you're in the non-Hispanic white group, you live 7 to 8 years longer than if you're in the African American. So today, I will finally declare I am non-Hispanic white. I didn't know that before. I finally found out I'm not Hispanic white. From now on, rather than saying I'm African American on the census or any kind of health survey and so on, I'm going to say I'm white. And from now, I am going to live 8 years longer than I was going to live 5 minutes. And it's just that simple when you think about it for a moment. What in the world does one's identity have to do with regard to what we observe? So this is, I'm a social psychologist by background and training. Social psychologists are known for the fact that we believe the whole world can be put into a 2x2 table. We teach that to our graduate students. They learn that the first week that they're here. We pound that into them. So, but I'm here to say also, as a social psychologist, we really don't believe that. I mean, we know better than that, just to make sure that you understand that. So, one way of thinking about this is that the self, a person can say, yes, I'm black, no, I'm not. The other can say, yes, you're black, or they can say, no, you're not black. I mean, they can say a lot of other things too as well. What's interesting about this table is that the biggest differences that we see in morbidity and mortality occur on this particular axis between non-Hispanic white and African American. And every single one that's off that particular axis, what you find there is that they are not consistent differences. Asians may indeed live longer than non-Hispanic whites, Afro-Caribbeans and so on. And what's interesting about this is that these groups actually contest their racial placement. African Americans as a group have never contested their racial placement. That is, people say you're black, and African Americans say, yes, I'm black. So the case is not a story about identity. It's about the fact of being identified. And that's a very different kind of issue. And once a person can be identified as being in a particular group, then all the stress and chronic stress process can operate. All the things about discrimination and racism and other kinds of unfairness become very easy to do when I can look at you and identify what particular group you are in. And so this is what we think is one pathway for why you see the differences that we see between population groups. It really doesn't have to do with regard to people's identity. It really has to do with regard to being identified. And so the law of small effects, this is very important. I want you to kind of remember this as we go through. There's no one single factor that produces the observed differences that we see. In fact, people who say, I'm going to find out the reason why people have their disparities between groups, it's a fruitless search. It's actually a group of small differences that accumulate over the life course, as I showed you before, that produce the observed differences in adulthood and older ages. And I'm going to provide you data to support that particular argument. And by that I mean things like gene-gene and gene-environment interactions. And discrimination and perceived racism are an important candidate. Cultural factors play a role. Behavioral differences that exist between individuals in different groups. SES and institutional arrangements. Social and psychological factors are also important in terms of contributing to these differences. What I'm going to talk about today, though, has to do with regard to life course selection. And this is probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say. Accumulated treatment differences. Those of you who are familiar with McEwen's work on allostatic load or Geronimus's work on weathering, that talks about the fact that these chronic stressors take their toll over time and create the problems that we see. I agree with that. I have nothing that would be different from what they think. And I'm going to talk about culturally and environmentally mediated behavioral coping strategies. It's very difficult to parse these out into what their constituent parts are. They interact with each other, they change over the life course, and so on. So it's very difficult to find one thing that causes this. There are large disparities in living arrangements that favor non-Hispanic whites over blacks. For example, negative neighborhood characteristics. We know that neighborhood segregation is related to negative health outcomes. There's lots of research on this, by Levis, by Wallace, by Rue, over the years. They are differentially stressful. People live in neighborhoods that are differentially stressful. Trust me, if you live in a neighborhood where there's drive-by shootings, that's a more stressful neighborhood than living in Okemos. Is Okemos still like it was before? Okay, so I don't have anything against that. I mean, I wouldn't mind living in Okemos. I mean, no, so you get this whole, and they're differentially stressful. And there's a lot of research which suggests that. So as we begin to look at this particular framework and model, the environment is a direct source of physical health disorders and differences between people who live in one neighborhood versus the other neighborhood. Think, for example, asthma as an outcome, and think about particulates in the air, which create that. Or think about lead in some neighborhoods and buildings that are not in other places. So there's a direct effect, and indeed affecting people's health outcomes. Neighborhoods are also differentially stressful with regard to job availability or family problems or financial issues and relationships. So that's an important thing. And we know from a lot of research that stressors themselves are related to bad health outcomes. But neighborhoods also do different things. Neighborhoods actually afford differential opportunities for jobs and for other kinds of things. People who live in certain neighborhoods have better outcomes for them. They also afford something else, which is a little bit more in cities. They also are the source of differential coping resources. Fast food outlets, liquor stores, illegal drug distributions, and so on. Neighborhoods differ along that particular issue. So these poor health behaviors are also found as a result of the environments that people live in. We know a lot that people indeed engage in certain kinds of behaviors because they're stressed. A lot of research on self-medication and those kinds of things. I don't deny that. And we know what the poor health behaviors are related to these physical health disorders. As a smoker, I don't smoke now, but I used to smoke. And people who are smokers know that they're always smokers, even though I quit in 1976, July 2nd, at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. That's when I quit. So, but the fact is that those kind of behaviors have negative outcomes on physical health disorders, whether diabetes, cancer, organ damage, or overall shortening people's lives. So the starting epidemiological paradox that's very important for what we understand is disparities in physical health favor whites, but disparities in mental health generally favor blacks. Why is that? Why is it that the things which produce the physical health differences don't seem to produce the psychiatric health differences, particularly now that we measure it right? And how do we understand that? So it's this paradox that we're trying to understand. So there are large disparities in all-cause and specific cause death rates. Infant mortality rates have declined, like I showed you, but there's still large differences that favor whites over blacks. And there are large disparities in healthcare utilization between African Americans and whites. These are well-known facts. So if we look at just some data, I'm not going to show you a lot of data. What's really interesting about this is not that blacks in the pink. Does that look pink to you? I mean, males have terrible, I know. I think it's pink. That was a little joke. My assistant made blacks pink. But anyway, and so what you see are these, I don't know. So there are large differences. I thought it was funny. In what happens here. But this is for females between 2004 and 2005. What's really interesting about this graph, and really struck us, that if you look at the younger years, this is up to 44 years, there are no disparities. There are no disparities in diabetes, if you look at that. By age adjusting the data, people have not been able to see this. But when you disaggregate it, you find this particular effect. The same thing is true for hypertension for males. There are very small differences that are in the younger years. The point is that disparities are actually a function of the life course. As people age over the life course, you indeed begin to get these large differences that exist between population groups. And I could show you 1,000 more slides which look exactly the same as these two slides I just showed you. Now, there are links from childhood. I'd be the last person to deny that getting diabetes at 50 years old didn't have something to do with regard to what went on in the previous parts of your life. Blacks over the life course actually live the fewest number of years. There's no doubt about that. And these things are really linked in very complex ways over the life course. But these things are a product of aging. So, controversial thing first. This is probably the most controversial point I want to make. That blacks may be more highly selected for positive health than whites early in life and also late in life. And many of you are aware of the late life crossover. So that if you are black in this society and you live to 80 years of age, I'm trying to get there, if you can get to 80 years of age, then you're going to live longer than a comparable white at 80 years of age. It's called the late life crossover. And we've known about this for a very long time. Lots of data on that. I argue that the roots of that crossover actually begin at conception. So we know this is all the points up to infant mortality and all the various different stages, late fetal, neonatal. And these are mortality rates for African Americans at every single point up through infant mortality. And we already know that things like spontaneous abortions and other kinds of things are much higher. So what we argue, if you just assume that weaker organisms die before stronger organisms, that there's a culling of the African American population such that by the time they reach 1 year, 1 day of life after infant mortality, they are a stronger set of organisms that are non-Hispanic whites. If you add into that the lack of kind of heroic interventions, it even makes the point even more. So if that's true then, it can indeed account for why we don't see any disparities early in life and why we get this weathering over the life course to produce the disparities in midlife. So what does that look like? This is a this is a sigmoidal curve which shows you very high rates of death for blacks over whites up to infant. This is less than 1 year, 1 year, 1 day of life. But look at what happens. So anything below 1 means that it favors blacks. They have better rates of mortality than whites. Anything over 1 means it favors whites. So whites actually die at higher rates than blacks from stress-related causes in early life. They're actually higher rates than for African Americans. But look at what happens over the life course. As you begin to reach middle age, late adulthood, those numbers just accelerate. And then you get the mortality crossover at the end of life. This is true for females. This is true for males. And this is true for all-cause mortality. You see exactly the same sigmoidal relationship over the particular age differences. We argue that this is consistent with a model of stronger organisms early in life that are able to resist the negative stressors of living in bad neighborhoods and sort of things. But over time, they indeed are weathered out because of the chronic stressors in their life, and they begin to die at higher rates. Now, I know this is controversial. We've done quite a bit of research on this. Everything so far is consistent with this. For example, if we look at disaggregating when the death rates occur in African Americans, you can see that the highest rates of death are here, up to 1 year, 1 day of life, and then here at midlife. And that earlier points in time do not contribute appreciable amounts to the death rate differences between blacks and whites. Poor health behaviors parallel the data I just showed you for what we see, for the same disparities that we see. So this is smoking among males. And this is very, very interesting. So this is African Americans in pink and non-Hispanic whites in green. And what's interesting is that African Americans, and this is well known, have lower rates of smoking earlier in life than do whites. But what's really interesting is what happens in midlife. The rates of smoking for African Americans actually increase. This is African American males. This is obesity in females. And while this is one of the few things that we see that are actually higher, and what happens for African American females is that by the time African American females get to be about 50 years old, rates of obesity are almost 60% in the population. Almost 60% in the population. There's a reason for this, just like there's a reason with regard to the smoking. These are not random things that occur within the population over time. Vigorous physical activity for females. At every point in the graph, white women have higher rates of vigorous physical activity than black women. And the point I'm going to make very shortly is that black women don't have to engage in vigorous physical activity. And the reason why they don't have to engage in vigorous physical activity is because they're eating. And eating serves exactly the same function as vigorous physical activity. If you look at males, though, you see something very different. African American males actually are so vigorously physical earlier in life in comparison to whites that we love to give them Ritalin, and lots of Ritalin when they're young, because they're just so active. And this activity is problematic. But if you look over the life course, what's also interesting about African Americans as they get older, males particularly, is that with midlife comes the inability to be visibly physical and vigorous because the knees go out. Can't play basketball when those knees go out, or the hip goes out, or whatever the case may be. And African American males, unlike African American females, actually then have to turn to other stress reductive mechanisms in order to deal with the stresses in their life. This is true for heavy alcohol use. For African American males, low rates of use early in life, higher rates of use in midlife and afterwards. It's also true with regard to drug use of any kind. It's also true for marijuana use. Although those young people started using marijuana, but you also see this particularly. Mental health disparities. And I've already given this one away, but that's all right. The models say that we should see exactly the same relationships that we observe for morbidity and mortality, right? Bad neighborhoods, bad poor health behaviors, bad psychiatric health disparities. I mean, that's what the models suggest. The only problem that in comparison to health status, that there are very few studies that have been done since 1981. In fact, there are no studies that have been done since 1981 that's ever found this to be true. No studies, and I'll show you some of those. These are all the major national studies that have ever been done. The NHANES, National Comorbidity Study, the National Survey of American Life, different methodologies, different ways of doing things, the NISAR. Every single study shows that indeed higher rates of major depression for non-Hispanic whites than for African Americans. What's wrong with that particular model? It suggests that socioeconomic status can't account for what we see. And the problem is, it means that the kind of description of disparities, which has driven the work that we do in this area, is not enough. We need theoretical models that can account for this, for both psychiatric morbidity as well as for physical health morbidity. So we became very much interested in what we call the self-regulation of health behaviors. How do we understand the interrelationship between physical and mental health disparities? And one of the things we're interested in is the utilization of stress coping mechanisms over the individual life course. The affordances model says the following things. Structural life inequalities are hypothesized to cause both health and mental health disparities. It's clear that structural inequalities in income, in wealth, and all of these things favor non-Hispanic whites over African Americans. Physical health disparities in morbidity and mortality, as I showed you before, are unfavorable for African Americans, but mental disorder disparities actually favor African Americans. Why is that? So this particular model is the model that people like to see, but the only problem is it's not what we observe for some groups in this particular society. Why not? And I want to talk about the social psychology of disparities. How do we understand that? Remember the issue of motivation. One, coping strategies in the face of non-race and race-specific stressors are themselves harmful to people's health. That's the first part of this model. So one of the things that we know, and I know, and other people in this room who have ever done it, is that if you smoke, it really feels better. You know if you go home after a hard day work, stressful day at Michigan State University, and have 2 martinis, that you're going to feel better. You know that indeed after a stressful event, if you go and have a Twinkie, you're going to feel better. Or Kentucky Fried Chicken. or Popeye fried chicken. You feel better after you eat those. The only problem with those things, as we'll see, is they're slowly killing you. Stress-related precursors, this is very important, of serious mental health problems are more available to consciousness than are those of physical health problems. If you are having a bad day at Michigan State University as a graduate student, by the end of the day, you know it. And how do you know it? You've got a headache, your stomach hurts, you don't feel good, all those kinds of noxious things that go along with regard to being under stress, and particularly being under chronic stress. You are aware of it. It's aware of your consciousness. You are growing a tumor for cancer. How do you know you have it? There are no clear signs for this until it gets so late with regard to the process that it's there. So the point we made is that the psychological awareness of the noxiousness of the stressor motivates people to action. People are not passive recipients of the negative, noxious, stressful things in their life. You are motivated to do something about it. If you don't feel good, you're going to do something about it, right? For example, and Dahlman's work was very important in this work, the work that we do. She works with animals. She's a neuroscientist from UCSF. She suggested that people eat comfort foods to reduce activity in the chronic stress response network, that it has this effect. And there's just tons of research about this for animal models and emerging more and more for humans as well. It is proposed that other behaviors, smoking, alcohol, and drug use, have similar effects to indeed that are immediate to reduce activation of the stress response network. That all these things work. Now they work in different ways. They're not all the same. You know, I'm not a biologist nor am I a neuroscientist, but the fact is I can read that literature. And it's very clear that indeed these effects are there. It's complicated and all the rest of it. But all these things that we call bad behaviors, these bad behaviors actually reduce the activation of the stress response network. So this is the model that we work on. And I'm going to show you some data that we think supports this particular model. And the argument is that poor health behaviors, smoking, drinking, using alcohol and drugs, and overeating, particular kinds of comfort foods, has effects on the activation of the HPA axis. But they also serve to buffer the relations of the chronic activation of the HPA axis on psychiatric health disorders, while at the same time contributing to the physical health disorder differences that we see. This is the framework and the model that we're working on and have been for a while, but we're not as far along as we possibly could be. Because this is a very complicated, this is much more complicated network than I ever thought. I never thought I'd be reading the neurobiology of stress. I'm on page 20 of 715 pages. It's tough going. You know? But the fact is that there's a lot of work on this. But indeed, summarizing that work, I think this is a fair kind of summary of what people have done. So what are the hypothesized effects to the HPA axis? It's the complex interactions, obviously, between endocrine and neurological systems. Under chronic stress, negative feedback breaks down and there's continued release of CRF and cortisol. Long-term chronic activation of the HPA axis and related hormonal systems may be related to the etiology of some mental disorders. And in fact, the mental disorders that we focus in on are the stress-related mental disorders, particularly anxiety disorders and depression. Those are two of the ones that we're very much interested in because they have been shown in some work to be related to stress. It's the interference of this particular stress, as I'm going to talk about in a while, which protects some individuals and groups from developing these particular disorders. Dahlman suggests strongly, and a lot of this work suggests strongly, that humans have evolved very nicely to deal with acute stressors. We do a pretty good job at that. What we don't do a good job is chronic stressors. And Dahlman has talked about that, where the stress response cannot remove the stressor, and you get consistently activated central response network not good for the organization. So, comfort foods, high in fats and carbohydrates, may aid in the shutdown of the stress response. Alcohol, nicotine, and drug use stimulate release of dopamine and beta endorphins, which aid in the shutdown of the stress response and lead to feelings of relaxation and calm. Paradoxically, these behaviors and things and substances may also further activation of the HPA axis. This is a quote that I just like from McEwen that talks about what you do when you are under stress has a very, very important relationship to issues of allostatic learning. So the general hypothesis, the first one is the weak hypothesis. This is favored by my graduate students and postdocs. That's a little joke for some people who are postdocs and graduate students. They're always arguing with me, which is good. The notion here is that poor health behaviors actually mask the stress response cascade of these neural and hormonal events that have long-term effects on the development of mental disorders. Individuals are not able to report on stress-related symptoms that are ameliorated by poor health behaviors, though the physical cascade continues. Right, that's the weak hypothesis. The strong hypothesis, favored by James Jackson, and other crazy people, says that poor health behaviors, through their actions on the HPA axis and other brain hormones, actually interfere with the cascade of neural and hormonal events that ordinarily would lead over time to mental disorders. Right now, we can't really separate out these two. It'll take a lot of very molecular sort of work to make any sense out of this. You have a question? Yes.
Yeah. You're not suggesting that these comforting behaviors like drinking, smoking, and overeating are good for your mental health? I'm
absolutely saying that.
I think someone who goes home and needs a drink, or needs a cigarette, or needs to eat knows they're in trouble.
Yeah, they probably do know they're in trouble.
And that is stressful.
But
You can't have that drink and, as in alcoholism or any kind of addiction, takes a toll mentally.
All right, I'm not going to get a chance to talk about everything, but one of the things that we've become very much interested in is addiction and addictive behaviors. Because we want to argue that there are two things that happen for people to use when they choose to use these particular types of things to cope with the stresses in their life. They have the immediate effect of shutting down the stress response network, which is rewarding. Right? This is a straightforward operant conditioning issue. That is, you are under stressful conditions and you're young, and it so happens that you eat a Twinkie. You feel better. What happens the next time you're under that stressful kind of condition? You eat the Twinkie. Pretty soon, what do you do when you're under stressful conditions? You do that.
What happens when you tip the scale at 180?
But why do we have
obesity?
That's a very, very good question. Why are 60% of African American women at 55 years of age obese? Why is that?
Comfort food.
Well, yeah, but why are they eating the comfort foods?
Stress.
Well,
Which means
right.
you need another way to cope with stress.
Well, that's right. That's what I would say. But first of all, you got to understand what the relationship is. The worst word in the English language is the following thing: lifestyle. And I'm under a crusade to remove that word from the medical lexicon. And the reason why: lifestyle implies it's volitional, and you're doing it, and if you do these things, it's because of poor character. Our argument is that these behaviors are functional. They are functional behaviors, and they occur as a result of your learning a contingency. And the contingency is between the noxious nature of what chronic stressors do to you and those things which relieve those symptoms of the chronic stressors. And once learned, African American women, for cultural reasons and a lot of other reasons, learn early on that eating comfort food makes them feel better. African American males, on the other hand, are so active. And remember, these things are equivalent. Whether you're eating comfort food, or you're really active, or you're smoking marijuana, or you're doing these other things, they all have similar effects. And they're slightly different. I mean, the neuroscience rule, don't jump all over it. I know they're slightly different. And we're looking at those. But the effect is to shut down the stress response network, which is rewarding. The problem that we've been dealing with, though, is that these are highly addictive substances. And once you get addicted to these particular substances, what kicks in is a totally different reward system. Another reward system kicks in. And what's interesting about that then, and what the problem has been in trying to change people, stop smoking, stop drinking, and so on, is that there are two reward systems that are operating. One reward system is shutting down the stress response network, and you feel better in the face of chronic stress. And the other one is the rewards that you receive because of this addictive behavior. And they're slightly different systems, physiological systems which these things are going through. And they reinforce each other. That's the model that we're interested in testing. Now that model will take years to test. In fact, I won't even be around when it all gets tested because I don't plan on staying around that long. But that's the framework that we're trying to work with. And the effect is, particularly for stress-related mental disorders, is to prevent what? One, your ability to report on those symptoms that would lead you to make a diagnosis of the disorder. That's the weak hypothesis. That people, blacks, are not reporting that they're depressed because they're not having those particular symptoms that would lead them to report that. The other one says, no, it's really having certain kinds of effects. And we're now in the business of wanting to say that when you're disordered, it's a change in the brain. Being disordered, having major depression or having anxiety disorder is not all about the psychology of it all. You know, there's a tendency for us to kind of believe that. It's not all about the psychology. It's actually about certain kinds of changes. This hypothesis says that there is an effect of these things to change the nature of what happens to the brain. Right now, we just can't distinguish between these two explanations. So let me give you an example. Let me give you some data. Because I know this is hard to do, right? I mean, the thesis. So this is the analytic variables that we looked at. We're looking at things, we're looking at changes across time, because this is about that. Now, the first study was with the American Changing Lives study. These are some of the variables that we were looking at. We took a very impoverished measure of stress, which are just stressful events in people's lives. That is, loss of a spouse, loss of children, loss of job, those kinds of things. No social stress, no psychological stress. These are all stressful events, which all the people in this room would probably agree is a pretty impoverished measure of stress. And we looked at poor health behaviors, smoking, drinking, and BMI as an indicator of behaviors. It's not a behavior itself, it's an indicator of behaviors. Poor self-reported health, poor chronic health, you'll see why that's important in a moment. And DSM-3R, depression, which is what we're interested in. And this is a model over time to predict the change in DSM depression over the time period. And we're predicting that change. So, this is the model that says that structural life inequalities are related to poor physical health. They're also related to poor chronic stressors that we see, and this is related to the behaviors that people engage in. And we argue this part of the model is pretty well that people have looked at. For the most part, these are very conservative analysis. These are linear models that we're using, where everything before any particular point is controlled for. And we also control for gender. We control for all kinds of SES variables, region, and other kinds of things. These are models that we control for just about everything we can think of. And what we find is this particular effect for chronic health conditions, diabetes, other kinds of things, and so on. This is for whites. And what we find is negative structural conditions, negative stressful events, and so on, are negatively affecting the number of structural conditions. Poor health behaviors don't have much to do with these things. For blacks, we find an independent contribution of poor health behaviors to affect chronic health conditions and outcomes, which is really kind of interesting. It's like blacks have another source of the kind of differences that we see in chronic health outcomes. But the interesting one, and the bottom line that people are always interested in, is what happens with psychiatric health. And originally we started off with the same set of predictions, right? I mean, that's what the models have been telling us it should look like. But we argue that if what we say is true, then these behaviors should buffer the relationship between chronic stressors on psychiatric health, measured by the DSM-3 in this particular case, for this particular study. So this is for whites, and what we find is that the interaction term is absolutely non-significant. There is no effect, there is no buffer. So this is what it looks like. In fact, this additive relationship. So under low stress, this is standardized and centered. Under low stressful conditions, there are no differences as a function of the number of negative health behaviors you engage in. But under high stressful conditions, there's an effect that the more you engage in, then the higher the probability of your being a case of major depression. But this is not significant for whites. When we look at blacks, the relationship is significant. Significant effect in terms of poor health behaviors, buffering the relationship between negative stressful events. But what does that interaction look like? It looks like this. For African Americans who have more stressful events in their life, in the way in which I told you, if you engage in 0 of these behaviors, no smoking, no drinking, low BMI, the probability of your being a case is 0.8. If, on the other hand, you engage in lots of these behaviors, it's almost 0. Which is what we predicted. That if you're living under these kinds of conditions of life, and it's very stressful for you, and you're smoking, and you're drinking, and you're overeating, and you're doing drugs and other kinds of things, you are indeed protected from becoming a case of major depression. And if you don't do those things, you're in deep trouble.
Could I just ask?
Sure, you can ask anything.
Do you have any clues about what's going on among the individuals who are not engaging in these dangerous behaviors, the ones in the upper part of the curve? Any interview data from them, any qualitative data from them that give you some clues about why they're behaving as they are, or not behaving like the rest of them?
No. No, I don't. I'm sure that, with this particular hypothesis, that indeed people will be looking at that. Because the problem is that the question I always get is, well, what about praying? And what about social support? And what about all these other things? And let me tell you what I think about that. I think prayer is good. My grandmother used to pray for me, and I always used to tell her, please do, because I greatly appreciate that. And I even pray for myself sometimes when it's really necessary. Social support is very important and so on. But the problem with those things is that they're not efficient. They're not efficient for what we're arguing is a major mechanism. The thing about smoking and overeating and drug use is that it's extremely efficient in shutting down the stress response network. It's almost instantaneous. That's the reason why, when you're feeling stress, having 2 martinis, you feel better. Anybody who says that's not true, you're in denial. People who smoke, if you're feeling stressed, having a cigarette was wonderful. I mean, you really feel better. Popeye chicken makes you feel better. There's no doubt about it. The only problem is it's a killer. That's the only problem with it. But if you're worried to the extent about losing one's mind, think about the trade-off and the trade-off that people make. So people are not stupid. They know when they weigh 180 pounds and they're 4'11", it's not good. People know that drinking to the point where they're intoxicated or smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day, like I used to, or other things that people do are not good for you. But people continue to do that. Why? Because they really don't want to lose their mind. That is a terrible thing to happen. Right? So people indeed will engage in these particular behaviors, and they actually feel them. There's a question.
Can you say a little bit about how, you would think that people who are in UHB 0 are perhaps more likely to seek care and therefore be diagnosed
I don't.
compared to the UHB 3s? Do you think there might be some of that going
No,
on?
we're doing analysis now with a much bigger data set, the NESAR. I'm going to show you some, I got 2 more data sets to show you, but we're actually looking at that right now, because that's one plausible explanation, that there's something different about these particular individual groups in some particular sort of way that affect what the relationship is, right? I mean, that's a reasonable hypothesis, and it has to be looked at, and we're looking at it, yes.
So 6 on the horizontal axis means 6 standard deviations above the mean?
It's whatever that standardized stress measure means. I don't really know the answer to that question. But that's probably a good estimate.
There wouldn't be very many people out there.
Well, actually, but the numbers are large enough so that the effect is stable. That's not a real problem for us. And I'm going to show you, this is a data set that only had 4,000 people in it. And that's what we're working with, about 4,000 people. But I got a data set to show you later that we're working with 40,000 people. And I don't think that's a problem. But I know exactly what you mean by that. But these effects are stable. So if we look at, so this is for whites, what I just showed you, in the ACO, and this is for blacks. So a lot of people say they get worried about this. They really don't like this effect. No. So you're telling me that doing all those bad things is good for something. Well, it's good for something and it's good for nothing at the same time. And don't get me wrong, because I know better. Right? Your point is well taken. So we replicated this study within the Baltimore epidemiologic study. A different study, somewhat better measures, but the same kinds of analysis that we did before. Again, about 3,500 people in this particular sample where we looked at this. This is the effect for whites. It's exactly the same effect I just showed you in the previous study. For whites, you get an interaction effect. Again, it's not significant, but the effect is that you tend to get this effect at high levels of stress. This is blacks. Exactly the same effect I just showed you with regard to the ACL. Totally separate, independent data set. Some of the measures are even better than what the other data set is, and the relationships are the same. So if you don't like that, we said, where is another data set that you could look at? So we took a look at the NESAR data set, which has 40,000 people. It's a 2-wave sample, has some of the same kinds of measures in it, although they're slightly different. And we did exactly the same analysis over time that I just showed you from the previous 2. And what we find, there are 6,000 blacks in this, 19,000 non-Hispanic whites. And these are the controls. I mean, we really are controlling for a lot of stuff when we do this. And the stress measure is a series of stress life events, just like we had before. And what we find, this is for whites, it's not significant under highly stressful conditions. And this is for blacks. It's a big data set. This is a significant effect. But it's exactly the same pattern. That is, if you're low UHB, engaged in those behaviors, you're under stress, you have a higher probability of being a case of major depression. 3 separate studies, independently done, all kinds of different kinds of measures, the same kind of longitudinal study, and we replicate the effect in every single one. I think replication is the hallmark of what we do. We feel pretty good about that. There is something going on here. Do we have the right explanation for it? No, I'm not going to pretend like I do. But there is definitely something here that produces these particular kinds of effects. We call this our perverse effect. This is perverse as hell. I'm the first person to say it's perverse. That you have a population group, right, that has to engage in behaviors which endangers its very life with 8-year differences with regard to mortality and chronic health conditions and everything else in order to be able to preserve their mental health because of the kind of chronic stresses they live in. There's nothing pleasant about that. But indeed, that seems to be the effect. So, disparities in these things exist. We don't know exactly why. The differences between physical and mental health disparities are not easy to understand. But one route may be mediated by the kind of behaviors that some racial and ethnic groups use. These behaviors are influenced by gender, by culture, and by environmental opportunities. So blacks have very early learned environmentally mediated effective coping strategies. They learn these early, they become conditioned to the stimuli of the noxious, stressful events, and they use these over time, as long as you can use them. Right? I made the point with regard to black males versus black females. So one of the good things about this. We have some other data which are really very interesting. For example, if you look at low-educated white women versus low-educated black women, it's a very interesting relationship to obesity. And in fact, we've discovered that low-educated white women have higher rates of mortality than lower-educated black women. And we hypothesize is that the reason why you see this is that because low-educated white women are more likely to be engaged in smoking and drinking and drug use and other kinds of behaviors. And that's exactly what we find. Much more so than black women. Black women have the lowest rates of all those kind of behaviors in any other gender race group in the United States. But they have the highest rates of obesity and the highest rates of eating comfort food. The only good thing about obesity is that it's a slow killer. It's a slow killer. Those other things kill you very quickly. These behaviors may be effective, perhaps through the stress response network or some other kinds of things, to create what we see. And these behaviors, though, contribute along with these bad living conditions and lack of resources and chronic stress to produce the kind of negative differences that we see in physical health and mortality. So these things are effective. This is part of the perverse things. They preserve African American mental health, but they simultaneously contribute, along with the structural inequalities, to produce the kind of disparities that we see in morbidity and mortality. So what we think, statistically, blacks and other groups in this society may buy their reduced levels of psychiatric morbidity with higher rates of physical health morbidities and access and early mortality. So this just makes the point that you need a bioecological model that talks about these particular interrelationships. A mind is a terrible thing to lose, and that human agency and individual motivation must be considered in any theoretical formulation that relates to explaining population health disparities. And do we have any time for any questions? I'm sorry about that. I'm going to shut up right now. All right? Really good. So I was good, and I allowed questions as we were going along, but are there any more questions? There's somebody back in the back.
To some degree, I'm confused how the results that you found support the idea of these substances and behaviors having a physiological effect. Because it would seem that if they should have a physiological effect, then it should be the case that you should see that effect across both race groups, because this is right. Because this should be to some degree below the level of what race you are, but yet over three large studies you don't see it within the white population.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's really fascinating. In fact, I'm going to talk a lot about this at APS, but the fact is that this research has actually opened up a whole new way of thinking about race and a whole new way of thinking about how we should conceptualize it because of that particular point. Unless we want to specify that African Americans are a different biological entity than whites, these data make no sense. These data make no sense whatsoever. It's the reason why, in fact, this whole work on race differences is the reason why people just really flock to genetic differences. No matter how many times that explanation flops, people just can't get away with the fact that these are genetically different groups. Even though the data are just, it's ridiculous. It's not a ridiculous idea. So where we are now In fact, let me tell you the first thing. I had a lot of other slides I could have shown you. So what we've done is asked the question. The question was, why did we get this? So what we really believe is happening in the United States of America is that race is not a variable in the way in which we think about it. And that blacks who are 2 years old are very different than blacks who are 50 years old. Race is a destination. It is a destination which is influenced by the experiences that people have over their life course. And blacks in this society become black. They're not black when they're young. And that's a very important observation. The reason why we find for blacks overall these effects is because they're a vulnerable group, as I showed you before. The issue is a population composition issue. So we asked the question, if we could make whites black, would we see the same effect? So we've been using propensity score analysis to create black people out of white people. That's just a little joke, folks. So you can laugh about that. So the idea, and what we look at for whites who look like blacks, and we use various different estimation models. Right now we're working with about 14 different variables. It's a variant of propensity score analysis, but not exactly that. If you do that, those whites show exactly the same interaction effect as blacks. Exactly the same. And if we look at blacks who look like whites on those variables, you lose the interaction term. And they look like whites overall. And if you look at blacks who are blacker than black on the particular estimation, this effect just gets stronger. It suggests strongly that this is not a story about different biology. It's really a story about how we think about what race is. And we're going to have to think differently with regard to what our particular conceptions are and how we understand race. It's the reason why you don't see any disparities in early years. Blacks are different at 5 than they are at 50. And the idea of assigning a race group to people and then saying it's the same thing over life, when all the knowledge we have about exposure factors for these different groups, we know they're different, but we've never thought about it that way because we've been so hot on race as a variable that I can assign you at birth, and that's your assigned race forever. Race is not what's going on here. It is indeed about vulnerabilities. It's about the kinds of lives people live, what the circumstances are, and so on. And unfortunately, if we give whites the kinds of lives that blacks have over their particular life course, they look just like blacks in terms of how they respond and react, which is exactly what you'd expect to see if the biology was indeed a consequence. Now, do I have molecular data? Can I mention one study? So these are the work that we're doing that came out of this. This first one is very, very interesting. So we're doing a cardiovascular disorder study. And again, based upon the framework, we know there's a relationship between cardiovascular disorder and depression. I mean, and in talking to physicians, their argument to me was, well, of course, I'd be depressed too if I had a heart attack. That's why they're depressed. And we say, no, that's not why they're depressed. They're depressed because what's the first thing you tell them after the heart attack? Stop smoking, stop drinking, stop, not too much sex, stay away from the drugs, other kinds of things, and so on. No wonder they're depressed. And it's the reason why only 18% in large epidemiological studies, only 18% of the people who start cardiac rehab finish it. And cardiac rehab has been shown to be one of the most effective ways of extending people's lives after a heart attack. But only 18% of the people finish it. Why? Because you've taken away those things which are working to protect them with regard to this. Our prediction is, in this study, we only have one prediction. We're halfway through the study right now. It hasn't been unsealed, so I don't know what the effects are. In this study, we predicted if you're living under chronically stressful conditions, you have a heart condition which is bad enough to recommend for cardiac rehab. If you follow the recommendation of the physician, you'll be a case of major depression at the end of 1 year. That's the prediction that we're testing. We're doing the same thing with type 2 diabetes. Another study with a type 2 diabetes clinic, same prediction. Type 2 diabetes, people are given type 2 diabetes and they stop going to the physician. They don't see them. Well, why? Why is that? Our argument is that you've taken away those things which work for them. Therefore, that shows you what the roots are for how you would intervene in these particular circumstances. That's why this is a very hopeful theory. I know it sounds awful, but it's environmentally mediated. It's not a story about race. We don't think it's a story about genetics. It really is a story about what goes on in people's environment. One question here, then one there.
Have you ever been able to collect data like these in a country where blacks aren't subject to the same sort of vulnerabilities that they are here?
Yeah, that's a good question, and obviously we would expect that to happen. Unfortunately, in most places around the world, we talk to people in South Africa, they really like this theoretical notion. They say it accounts neatly for some data that they have in South Africa that they haven't been able to account for and what you might see. But we might expect to find a difference. I could have talked about a totally different topic today. We are working with Caribbean black populations. And the reason why we work with Caribbean black populations in the Caribbean, in England, in Canada, and the United States is because they're a model system for disentangling race and ethnicity effects. So one of the things we know from some of the data that we see is that Afro-Caribbean blacks are very different than African Americans on a lot of different things. And in fact, in psychiatric disorders, they actually have worse rates of psychiatric disorders than do African Americans, which is predictable from the model that we have, because they actually lead better structural conditions of life. So we're trying to study that and make some sense of it. But your point is well taken. That's exactly right. One last question. There was one person.
It seems that you're suggesting that if white women smoke, drank, and overate, we could reduce the incidence of depression in white women. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, so one of the theoretical notions that we're looking at now is about what. So we're using the NHANES because the NHANES is a nice data set for looking at this. So one prediction that we've made that we haven't figured out yet, what are the rates of depression within those white women who are in those circumstances? But remember, in some ways what we're saying is that those white women of low education who are living in these kind of mean conditions are in some ways actually black women without the cultural accoutrements that black women have. And I didn't go into all the cultural reasons for black women in terms of overeating, but they don't have those. And there are lots of other cultural issues that are important here. For example, the desire to be thin, which is much heavier, which is much more significant among white women than they are among black women. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Preferences of black men with regard to women, the nature of parents and grandparents and so on, and what happens within the neighborhood. The culture issues become important in understanding this too as well. But we would predict that to be the case, and we're actually testing that right now. I don't know the answer to it yet. Good question. Okay? Thank you very much for being for attending.
Thanks again for sharing your research with us, and we have a small token of appreciation.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Please join us upstairs for the reception, and we can have more conversation.
And if you want to come up there and beat me up, that's all right. I can take it.